Okay, guys, we're jumping into chapter 6, Justice. Yeah, okay, we still haven't got none. Oh, here we go. So this looks like it's a quote, something she said, it's in italics. We live in an amazing country, but it is a country that is still riddled with implicit bias, discriminations, and even outright racism in the rooms and halls of Parliament and from coast to coast to coast. There are young kids across the country today who are growing up with a far greater likelihood they will be a Colton and Tina rather than a Jody or Corey, and even this is a difficult distinction. This is wrong. Some of these words were recounted in an opinion piece I wrote for the Globe and Mail on systemic racism and bold criminal justice reform following the tragic death of George Floyd. They also reflect sentiments I had shared internally throughout my time as Mojang, and especially in 2018 when these issues were in the headlines. My sentiments, while heavy on policy prescriptions, were also heartfelt. They reflected my own emotions and hopes that the government would finally act to undertake comprehensive criminal justice reform and specifically to get rid of mandatory minimum penalties. These feelings were particularly intense after the verdict in the death of Colton Boushie, who was from Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan, that saw an all-white jury acquit Gerald Stanley of second-degree murder. The verdict had set off a firestorm across the country. Both the Prime Minister and I had sent tweets and expressed compassion and concern, which caused some controversy. These events were also in the shadow of the murder of Tina Fontaine, a 15-year-old girl from Sagkeeng First Nation in Manitoba. She went missing in July 2014. Her body was found wrapped in a plastic and a duvet cover in Winnipeg's Red River. In 2018, a jury acquitted Raymond Cormier of second-degree murder, and the Crown did not appeal. Tina's tragic death renewed calls from activists for an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The controversy over our tweets was that some felt it inappropriate for the Prime Minister and me to offer an opinion on a criminal matter, but our tweets were not about that. They were about the systemic challenges of racism and disproportionate representation in our justice system. Of course, since 2018, there has been a significant awakening about these issues in Canada, the United States, and around the globe, exemplified by the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2021, for example, an independent commission found that the RCMP racially discriminated against Colton's mother, Debbie Baptiste, upon notifying her of her son's death. I expect that if the Prime Minister and I had sent those tweets today, there might not have been a controversy. But 2018 was a different time, and I reflected on and spoke out on this issue in many ways publicly and within government. I voiced how, despite the criticism, responding to the verdict was the right thing to do, something that previous generations of leaders had not had the courage to do. As leaders, we have to engage and encourage the national conversation and perhaps strengthen opinions for reform. Critics tried to push the narrative that we were wrong to speak out, that somehow our institutions were being undermined through our demonstration of leadership. Within this narrative, was the not-so-subtle assertion that the status quo of our justice system was the uncontested norm and must remain unchanged. I believe it became clear that we had the high ground. Our actions were different than what people were used to from past prime ministers and attorney general. But different doesn't mean there was anything wrong with them. Different is not the same thing as wrong. I wanted to be seen as playing the role of attorney general differently than in the past, when thousands of Canadians marched in the streets concerned about events in the justice system as they did in 2018. One would hope the AG would take notice and look at it carefully. I believe then and believe now that our justice system and the rule of law are not fixed. Oh no, they sure aren't. Oh, when was this book made? So looks like from the copyright this was 2021, 2022, and we're like 2-3 years since this book, and Canada has gotten way worse. Like, they exist in the context of people's lives and experiences. The health of our democracy particularly rests on the ability of our institutions to adapt and be responsive to the changing realities in Canada. I had previously been warned by the PMO strenuously to never raise the issue of mandatory minimum penalties with the Prime Minister again. I had heard the term out of runway used many times in relation to this issue while in government. I understood this to mean that the only things that were clear to take off at this time were issues linked to the next election and partisan advantage. Some of my staff, as much as I love them, were strongly advising against ever raising the issue of MMPs passing on a warning they too had received from the PMO, but I could not be silent. There has always been a direct connection between silence and injustice. Silence is the face of injustice. Silence in the face of injustice is a self-interested form of cowardice. Silence sustains and ultimately feeds harm, while speaking out can drive progressive change. Indigenous people know this all too well. It is a simple fact that we have made our voices heard, and more Canadians raise their voices as allies. Change in the direction of justice emerges. This is equally true in our daily interactions, where racism and discrimination rear their ugly heads, as well as in broad societal change. Well, here I was, the Indian in the cabinet, being effectively told to shut up about a fundamental matter of justice because it was not timely or politically expedient. My God is right. That was me, not Jody. Along with bold criminal justice reform, two of my core priorities were the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights and judicial appointments. Indigenous issues, of course, were deeply significant and personal, and central to my decision to enter into mainstream Canadian politics in the first place. As a lawyer and former prosecutor, I was also deeply concerned about the need for greater inclusiveness, transparency, and diversity of experience in the judiciary. This required taking the politics out of how judges are appointed. Of course, all of these justice issues, Indigenous rights, criminal justice reform, and judicial appointments, are interrelated and share common themes. They are all about ensuring that our government and institutions are acting justly, respecting basic human rights, confronting the legacy of colonialism, including systemic racism, and ensuring the rule of law is upheld to its fullest for all people in this country, regardless of who you are. I was determined to set out an aggressive pace of change on Indigenous reconciliation from the very beginning of my time as Mojang. The Liberal Party had committed itself to this in its own platform, and it had been confirmed to me time and again by the Prime Minister that I was to help play a lead on these matters for the government. I knew we did not need to spend years reinventing or developing the overall policy approach. I was bringing with me the solutions and approaches that Indigenous people had shaped and advanced over decades. As with the related topic of environmental policy, these approaches have been supported by more reports, studies, and commissions than in the case in almost any other area of public policy in Canada. For generations, Indigenous leaders and others have recognized that they have to work on multiple fronts at once. On one hand, there is the need for nation and government rebuilding. On the other is the transformation of relations between Indigenous nations and the federal and provincial governments, including through changes in Crown laws and policies. Collectively, this work is about confronting the legacy of colonialism and creating cultural, social, and economic well-being that addresses the day-to-day realities that Indigenous people face. The information of nation-to-nation and government-to-government relations should have been reflected in our Constitution at the time of Confederation. It was not, and we still have to address that reality today. Invariably, at different times and in different ways, Indigenous leaders will focus on particular aspects of these challenges. My grandmother primarily focused on the rebuilding of our nation's internal structures, sustaining our culture and language, and the well-being of our communities. In our potlatch, the highest-ranking male leaders are called Hamatsa. In our system, I am a Hilgax, a role always held by women. I don't know how to say those. One of my jobs is to lead my Hamatsa, the chief, into the big house. This role can be translated as one who corrects the chief's path, in quotations. We show them the way, a metaphor for life. In the potlatch, this is symbolized in our rituals when the power of Hamatsa is tamed and he is ready to be chief. My dad shared much of his mother's focus, but he also spent years helping to lead provincial and federal Indigenous organizations, including the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the Native Council of Canada, the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, and the negotiations to establish the treaty process in BC. He became more focused on the external relationships with non-Indigenous people and creating a collective space for rebuilt nations to take their proper place in Confederation. I have tried to follow the example set by my grandmother and grandfather, and in doing so recognize that all of this work is ultimately integrated. As was the case with my father, much of my work and more of my time has been spent on transforming relations with the federal and provincial governments through leadership in Indigenous organizations and now as an MP. Just checking the time, guys. How's everyone doing? This helps to establish I don't think I skipped a sentence anyways. This helps to establish the external mechanisms to support reconciliations. But I view the heart of this work as creating the space and support for Indigenous peoples to rebuild their governments and nations so they can take care of their own citizens, steward their lands and resources, and make the best decisions to meet their needs and secure their futures. As Mojang, I was focused from the outset on creating the space and support for Indigenous peoples to undertake the necessary work of rebuilding. This meant changing federal laws, policies, and the practices within the government that are obstacles to Indigenous peoples controlling their own lives, communities, and governments. Yes, of course, that means the Indian Act. It is an amazing thing, a shocking thing, to imagine that in Canada, the central piece of legislation about Indigenous peoples is still the Indian Act, a segregationist, colonial, and racist law passed in 1876. The Indian Act is the principal statute that our Parliament enacted concerning Indigenous people, their governments, and their relationship to the Crown. And it remains the case. There is no excuse for this. It is because of ignorance, fear, greed, and lack of will that it is still on the books. In other words, it is still in place due to all the hallmarks of racism. As long as there is an Indian Act, there will always be institutionalized systemic racism in Canada with respects to Indigenous people. Ultimately, we must be rid of it. But the way you get rid of it is by creating pathways that support nations to determine their own governance models based on their Indigenous legal orders and traditions, and to move out of the Indian Act on their own terms, at their own pace, and without the federal government as a gatekeeper. This includes making sure that Indigenous governments, as they take greater control over land and resource decision making, and designing and delivering the services their citizens need, have the necessary access to revenue streams like any government does. Why hasn't this happened yet? For many reasons, but primarily because federal and provincial governments have lacked the political will and the understanding and capacity to make this change. To deconstruct and rebuild it all must start from a place of principle and the recognition of rights. Getting rid of colonial laws such as the Indian Act and changing laws, policies, and practices that run counter to nations rebuilding and that ignore Indigenous governments and peoples means the Indigenous rights, the basic human rights in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, and Section 35 of our Constitution have to be taken seriously. But our governments have not taken these rights seriously. Indeed, the pattern followed by governments over the years, including today, is to invest vast resources in continuing to fight Indigenous people in court to try to prove that these rights do not exist or mean little or nothing, rather than to get on with recognizing and implementing them. Believe me, I know this firsthand, and I know how hard but important it is to change this reality. Oh wow, guys, I knew this was a biggie, this chapter, but we're reading right till the pictures, guys. Wow. I think it's like 40 some pages. In running for federal office, I was determined. Sorry guys, I just had an image of Billy Ray Cyrus video I watched today. When Canada was founded, Indigenous people were left out. They were not there when the so-called Fathers of Confederation got together. Though tremendous effort and leadership by Indigenous peoples, we are increasingly aware of how wrong that was. The costs and challenges of that exclusion are massive. There have been an enormously dark legacy in the lives of Indigenous people who suffer under vastly higher rates of poverty, homelessness, suicide, and addictions than the rest of the population. Right now, currently, it's Indigenous and white people, I believe, that are homeless and on drugs. That's from what I have seen. And again, this has been 3 years since this book has been written. And it's unbelievable, the homeless rate since Jody wrote this book. Ah. And I know this because I was just downtown today. And I literally didn't even walk a block, and I must have ran into about 5 crackheads. I would say 4 were white and 1 was Indigenous. The challenges are in our social systems, including the roles that have to be played by education, health, and family protection services. They are in our economy and environment, where the disregard of Indigenous rights has led to massive uncertainty about investment in land and resource use. They are present in our culture and languages, where knowledge, insights, creativity, and innovation have been marginalized, ignored, or lost. And they are there in our cohesion as a country, where deep unresolved wrongs and tensions fester and cause confusion, unrest, and conflict. The Prime Minister and everyone in government knew this was a central priority for me. I also believed it was for them, as they had said so time and again. The Prime Minister affirmed this when he set out in all of his mandate letters to ministers that, in quotations, no relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. It is time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partisanship. End quote. It was fantastic he did this, and I was excited. Of course, some people will view my optimism as naive, and indeed, many have called me naive at various times. If part of being naive means having hope and expectation that people will hold high ideals and live up to them, then I have no problem with the label. I don't subscribe to the view that cynicism and low expectations regarding the conduct and aspirations of our elected leaders is healthy or helpful. We should always be striving to make the change to the status quo that are needed, and always doing and being better. The way things have always been done are not and cannot be the way things are. Indeed, such a view is ahistorical. We have always changed. Everything is always changing. Our responsibility is to push that change in directions that create more justice, freedom, and opportunity for all people, and to support each individual to meet their potential and aspirations in life. Saying this is the way things are is often given as a justification for doing little or nothing. It justifies nothing. It is the excuse given by those who have abandoned their responsibility to advance real change. The vision to get this work done, which had been set out broadly in the 2015 Liberal Party election platform, and to which I expected the government was committed, requires moving away from the long-standing pattern of slow, incremental, minor shifts and towards laying the transformative foundations that are needed for proper relationships. This means government needs to establish a new framework in law and policy that recognizes and implements Indigenous rights and that adheres to standards and principles in policy and decision making. No more of this hypocritical double standard about how the individual rights in the Charter are implemented by the collective rights of Indigenous people in Section 35 of the Constitution are not. This also means ensuring legislation is consistent with Indigenous rights, including the UNDRIP. I think it's UNDRIP. It's capital U, all capital, uppercase, UNDRIP, UNDRIP, that's what I'll say. In addition, a transformative approach means creating clear mechanisms for First Nations to move out of the Indian Act, bolstered by new institutions and supports that help them rebuild their governments and nations. Finally, to make all of this work, government needs to be accountable, which has not been the case in the past, nope, or the present. That was me. Our history as a country includes treaties being broken, rights being ignored, and court decisions not being implemented. No more oversight mechanisms are needed, along with no new modes of dispute resolution that can monitor and make sure progress continues. In the early months of government, focused as I had been on Maid and cannabis, there was not much visible to the public on the progress for building the framework for these mechanisms. We did not virtue signal in DOJ as much as maybe other ministers did, including, of course, the PMO, who were the masters. We focused more on getting work done rather than signaling we were going to do it. That said, the effort to get our own house in order within government to do this work in partisanship with Indigenous people was taking place, and this did lead to some initial public steps. There was considerable behind-the-scenes work going on in tandem with the more public face. This was why, for example, we developed the Principles Respecting the Government of Canada's Relationship with Indigenous People, which the government released in July 2017. The 10 principles, which I understood are still hung on the walls in both French and English, in every, CIRNA, all uppercase, and ISC office across the country. I don't know what that is. Across the country were intended to start preparing the public service for the larger shifts to come in how we work with Indigenous people. The goal was to set initial guidance on recognition of rights, to support efforts to end the denial of Indigenous rights that led to disempowerment and assimilationist policy and practices. A number of months before the release of the 10 principles, the working group of ministers was formed. This new and unique structure of cabinet ministers was created to help provide political guidance and coherence to the effort of turning the vision of a transformed relationship with Indigenous people into reality. The mandate of the working group was to review laws and policies to ensure that the federal government was meeting its constitutional and international human rights obligations as they related to Indigenous peoples. This was part of an effort at a historic renewal of relationships with Indigenous peoples. I was appointed chair of the working group, which included Carolyn in brackets INAC, Jane brackets Health, and 3 other ministers. The development and release of the 10 principles and the formation of the working group were advanced as part of the effort to address a whole suite of challenges within government. However, it was clear and wholly I don't think that's wholly. I don't know. Unsurprising that the government system, which included most of the cabinet colleagues, simply did not understand what the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights meant or how to effect it. While I know they wanted a different relationship, they did not know what that relationship should look like or how to build it. That was particularly true of INAC, the INAC, I keep seeing, I'm going to say INAC now, okay guys? Which was partitioned in August 2017. I just guessed there. In August 2000. Wow, that's just big words in this one page. Oh man. In August 2017, into Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada and Indigenous Services Canada, and frankly remains so to this day. Indeed, government abandoned the vision of a broad and comprehensive framework for recognition and implementation of rights. It is not talked about much anymore, and they do not frame their work that way because they are not doing it and do not really know how. From a policy perspective, I felt isolated on Indigenous issues in this early period. I spent a lot of time explaining and sharing a vision of how to move forward, but the PMO and many of my colleagues did not really get it. My department tried and produced lots of materials, but there were struggles. By 2017, I had brought in some additional internal expertise to help with that work and was continuing ongoing contact with external experts. This helped in getting the principles out the door and the working group up and running, but it also became an issue with the PMO and part of the building tensions I was experiencing with Carolyn. From my perspective, Sirna, including Carolyn, appeared to feel they knew better what needed to be done. The increasing efforts by the PMO to interfere with and dictate my work and to determine my staff seemed in part to be a tactic intended to bring my office more in line with the Sirna's vision of Indigenous relations. Doesn't this sound typical of Indigenous experience in Canada? The government saying to an Indigenous person, trust us, do as we say, we know best, and taking steps to keep pushing that view. Am I describing how the legacy of colonialism continues within our federal government? I am. But even with these challenging patterns emerging, I was still excited. I certainly knew that governments had talked big on Indigenous issues in the past with little getting done, but this felt different. The government had adopted the Indigenous language and frame of reference for this work. I felt that Indigenous peoples were being listened to and that my voice at the cabinet table could be one channel for, oh man, I can't get this page. Channel for this. As noticed, there was a core group of Indigenous leaders providing external advice based on years of experience. The renewed relationships with Indigenous peoples was going to be rights-based and principled. Small steps were beginning to be taken, steps that broke the period of long darkness optimized by the Harper era and reflected in the rise of Idle No More. Real change, I believed, was coming. On June 14th, 2016, some 7 months into the mandate and a year before the 10 principles were published, I had my first sit down with the Prime Minister on Indigenous issues, a stock take as these meetings were called. Carolyn was also there, as were our staffs and deputy ministers. The meeting was a good one. I expected the Prime Minister would weigh in on these issues directly. There is an important truth that proper relations with Indigenous peoples require direct engagement by the Prime Minister and senior ministers with Indigenous leaders. The Prime Minister would repeat this sentiment with government to cabinet colleagues and publicly soon after. The truth is how the nation-to-nation relationship is viewed by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have long said that the unfinished business of establishing proper relations must be done with the highest leaders directly involved, because this is how proper Crown-Indigenous relations should and could have been established before and after Canada was founded. This is also how many First Nations across the country understand their treaties. The Prime Minister was poised to demonstrate this publicly. In the past, Prime Ministers seem to have been reluctant to be this bold, to get as deeply involved in this work, or to make it a personal priority. When they had gotten involved, the results had not followed. Only former Prime Minister Paul Martin had really embraced this file, but he was only in office for a short time. I was happy Prime Minister Trudeau understood that he had to get his hands dirty and dig in personally if this was going to succeed. This was progress. From day one, publicly and within government, I was clear and also blunt about what needed to be done. I delivered the same message I had been delivering over the past many years to Indigenous leaders, as well as within government, basically to anyone who would listen. This included the idea that we needed to challenge Indigenous peoples. Yes, while we as the government had tough work to do to get our house in order, Indigenous peoples also had much to do. We had to put our proverbial ball in their court and give them what they have been asking for, and what we all know is needed: a confirmation of the political, governing, and legislative space for self-determination, including self-government and community and nation rebuilding. The Prime Minister had shared with me in various ways over the years the sentiment the First Nations have no idea how to respond to a government that gives them what they want. I did not feel this was a disparaging thought. It was a reflection on the reality we had before us, the hard reality of deconstructing the colonial legacy and rebuilding. I believe that government has a responsibility to give Indigenous people what they have been asking for and wanting, and that Indigenous peoples would then have to lead to self-determine how they wish to govern into the future and rebuild their nations. As I said to the annual General Assembly of the AFN on July 12, 2016, just 1 month later. So this was her speech in italics on page 149. I want to talk about the nation-to-nation relationship and share some thoughts on how we can focus our efforts to collectively set in place a course of action over the coming months that ensures we can turn all the good words, the goodwill, and the golden opportunity we have into meaningful progress with practical and discernible benefits on the ground within Indigenous communities to undertake transformative change. And I challenge the critics that say it cannot be done, those who on one hand say the government is not serious or sincere, and on the other say Indigenous peoples do not have what it will take or the resolve, or that the task is too great. And I make this challenge confident in the knowledge that there is no one in this room who would suggest that decolonialization is easy, and that we all appreciate that trust, especially where trust did not exist before, must be earned, and that it can just as easily be lost, and that we all understand that the stakes are high, incredibly high. We are talking about the lives of future generations of Indigenous children within Canada, about the very survival of our distinct cultures and ancient languages, about a way of life. Now is the time. The political and legal ducks are aligned. There is a friendly government, but we need your solutions. As a government, we are not going to impose solutions. With your leadership, we can and will make enormous progress. There is no need to refight battles that have already been won. Limited resources, time, and energy have to be expanded on building, not fighting, on creating, not destroying, on empowering, not protest. Pressing social issues must be addressed now, but nations need to be ready to assume jurisdiction and the responsibilities that come with it. And while the federal government has a crucial supporting role to play, the hard work is going to be the community. As I have said in the Commons, only the colonized can actually decolonialize. Decolonialize. No one can do it for you, so we are ready to implement the UNDRIP. So are we ready to implement the UNDRIP? Are we ready to finish the unfinished business of Confederation? I say we are, I know we are, so let us get on with it. We have much work to do, and I look forward to doing this work together. While I was happy about how well the June 14th stock take went, I did not have any illusions that many in government understood what this all meant in practice. That to do what I described, government would have to be far bolder and more courageous on Indigenous issues than it ever had before. It would take a cross-government or horizontal approach to allow for dynamic change in the role of government, including ending the colonial role the government had played through the Department of Indian Affairs. An exceptional amount of policy work would have to be done. In addition to progress on Indigenous issues, I was also excited and optimistic about what I was seeing early on in criminal justice reform and judicial appointments. The launch of MWIG, inquiry announced in December 2015 was progress as well. My mandate letter gave me an expansive direction to review and effect change in the criminal justice system, including sentencing reforms that have been made over the previous decade, reducing Indigenous overrepresentation, increasing the use of restorative justice, and addressing gaps for Indigenous people and the treatment of those with mental illness. When I became MOJAG, we immediately began working with the department on what criminal justice reforms were needed. We started a series of engagement sessions with experts and stakeholders and did tons of work with the provinces and territories. The first big engagement session was in Toronto, May 20, 2016, and included former Prime Minister Kim Campbell, who had been the first Minister of Justice and Attorney General. From that first session and all subsequent ones, the issues raised most consistently was mandatory minimum penalties. It was a prime topic of conversation with calls for widespread reform. MMPs take away a judge's discretion when imposing a sentence, and for many offenses require a certain prison term. When I was MOJAG, there were 72 offenses that had MMPs attached. The vast majority of these were introduced in the Harper era. There were 6 offenses with MMPs in 1892, 24 in 2004, and 72 in 2015. Their use has been long controversial. Many MMPs have been found to be unconstitutional by our courts as a form of cruel and unusual punishment, violating Section 12 of the Charter. There is also extensive evidence that MMPs disproportionately impact Indigenous people and other vulnerable and racialized populations, contributing to their overrepresentation in the prison systems. Discretion is vitally important so that a judge can consider the distinct circumstances, background, and context of a particular offender and impose an appropriate sentence that can both act as a deterrent and help effect rehabilitation. Removing this discretion does not help in meeting the core goals of sentencing, including the maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society. I began to echo what I heard during the engagement session on MMPs in every venue I could. I spoke about getting rid of MMPs, among other justice reforms, all the time in speeches during question period and with my cabinet colleagues. I was taking time with the engagement sessions because I wanted to ensure that we had all our bases covered, including directly seeking feedback from Canadians. I wanted the strong case for bold change to be watertight and to reflect the best ideas we had heard in the engagement. The department was amazing on this work. You could sense it was something they had really believed in and were eager to see done. I got the distinct feeling that people had been waiting for this and now realized we might actually make it happen. So we started work on a huge justice reform package with MMPs as a centerpiece. I was also jumping in headfirst on judicial appointments as MOJAG. You are responsible to appoint all federal judges and all superior court judges in the provinces and territories. There was a big gap to address with the large number of judicial vacancies across the country. Ironically, the opposition parties were quick to point out I was not doing this work fast enough. The truth is, we did not want to continue to rely on the existing process in making appointments as other ministers had. The power to appoint judges is an incredible responsibility that comes with significant long-term implications. It should not be exercised lightly, and certainly not any partisan or self-interest. Makes sense? I knew instinctively that the system I was now in charge of had to be more open and transparent. Of the breach of the bench was to, over time, reflect the diversity of Canada to look more like Canada. This will take time. We need a system that would become well known to the public and that would serve the needs of Canada beyond the life of one government. A system that would build on our foundation of judicial independence. I think many Canadians are appalled at the way partisanship affects how judges are appointed or elected to the south of us, and while the system I inherited was nowhere near as problematic as in the United States, it still was not, in my opinion, rigorous enough. I could see how previous ministers, while not outside of the law, had made judicial appointments that did not always pass the smell test. I was slower out of the gate on changing the Superior Court's appointment process than I had planned. It was a priority, but did take a bit of... Oh, I gotta adjust. Oh, I gotta take a sip. How are you guys doing? I'll take a sip of water. Alright. It was a priority, but did take a bit of a backseat to made initially. The task was to bring more openness and transparency into the process, make it more merit-based, increase inclusiveness, and I don't know, I don't know, I feel like that's a simple word, but I can't make it out, and I feel like I'm on the spot, guys. The process from political interference. In essence, to make it more accountable to Canadians. With respect to both improving the process and the eventual appointment of judges under a new process, I had to hire a judicial affairs advisor. I found an amazing one in Katie Black, a brilliant lawyer and passionate justice advocate who was a former clerk of Justice Beverly Lachlan, I don't know, was set out to review and improve the process. I am very proud of this work, although more work remains. During my time as Mojang, I appointed 250 judges. Diversity was improving and will continue to do so over time if the process remains, is strengthened even more, and is not compromised. As we are overhauling the judicial appointment process, Justice Thomas Cromwell notified the government of his intention to retire early, meaning a seat on the Supreme Court of Canada would be coming vacant earlier than planned. As Mojang, I would advise on the process to select the replacement and then prepare a recommendation for the Prime Minister. I felt humbled to do so. It was a significant responsibility and one I did not take lightly. Not only did it come with the possibility of shaping the court, and by extension the law, for years to come, but it was also about the process of determining what was important and who had the qualities required to oversee the issues the courts considers. I wrote a memo to the Prime Minister with contributions from my political staff and based on advice from the independent and nonpartisan advisory board that we had established in July 2016 for just this purpose. It was long, but I wanted to be thorough and detailed given the momentous importance of the decision that needed to be made. As always in life, I erred on the side of providing more information, not less, on the big things. Because of the memo's length, Katie and I wrote an overview summary with my recommendation at the top. By this point, we had been in office almost a year. While there were challenges, I could see progress taking shape on Indigenous issues, criminal justice reform, and judicial appointments.
If we did what we set out to do on these things, the country would be changed for the better in ways that were important and transformative. Yes, it was hard and there has been struggles and warning signs, but as the summer moved into the fall of 2016, I viewed those struggles as the growing pains of a government and group of ministers, including me, who were green and still learning the ropes. It was always going to be hard, but good intentions and serious commitments were still evident. I guess I was still sleeping at night, not for long, but soundly. This general sense of optimism that I was feeling turned out to be short lived. Oh, I remember a minister saying to me late one night, if you had to choose between Indigenous issues and MMPs, what would you choose? He went on, would you be okay with getting 70% of what you wanted on MMPs? I was confounded by these questions and even more so by the thinking they represented. Why would one try to do things halfway? Why would we choose to do less than we were able to Why would we choose to do less when we were able to do more? Why is it a trade-off, one or the other? How can one think about basic social justice issues and matters of rights in such crass, transactional terms? I suspect this question did not come from him alone, but from somewhere else. That same minister introduced me to the term red meat issues. If I lived in this world of partisan politics before coming to Ottawa, I imagine I would have known the term sooner. I was repeated again and again around many tables, and I came to realize it was usually used by ministers who had been given an indication by the PMO prior to the meeting of what needed to be said or emphasized. A red meat issue is one that is not politically expedient to tackle. It may cause us grief in discussions that take place around dinner tables of Canadians and may result in a loss of votes. As the days tick by, you move closer to the next election. Red meat issues become more and more part of the political calculus. I hated the term then and still do, the whole idea of it, not acting on critical issues, urgent issues, because of fear of losing votes. It remains so wrong. How will things change if this is the culture of our politics? Honestly, if you have no intention of moving on a red meat issue, even if you know it needs to be dealt with, then do not run on it or give people the impression you will do something about it. My limited exposure to federal politics at this level admittedly contributed to some of my challenges. Not knowing the playback and ways of doing business as well as some others was a challenge, but at the same time ignorance was bliss in brackets and maybe a virtue. My ignorance of the way things are supposed to work allowed me to continue to act based on standards, principles, and values I was raised to lead with. I was less worried about compromises for political purposes and more focused on debating substance. With respect to MMPs, perhaps I should have found ways to push them faster, tie them in other issues that were viewed as more politically expedient, and tact, tactily identify the ways and means to do so, to help make them more politically expedient for the party bosses. This is not to say that I was not pouring my heart and soul and blood, sweat, and tears into these issues. My office and the department were working flat out on all of these priorities, as was I. But the reality, as I came to realize over time, was that the government did not have strong intentions to move on these matters. The end result was that on much of the key work we would have done and were prepared to move on. Indigenous issues and MMPs, specifically the government, did not act. And on judicial appointments, while our main important reforms went through and hundreds of fantastic merit-based judges were appointed, something I am so proud of, the possibility of political interference in the appointment process has not been eradicated as fully as it could have been. Political interference, okay, guys? And this was about the appointment process, and we got like China interference. Oh, good God. Jesus. Okay, guys. In addition to my conversations on red meat issues, another early sign of how the challenges we're going to build came from a series of meetings, calls, and discussions between August and October 2016 with the Prime Minister, senior officials, and others within outside government. For a short time, I began to doubt whether I was doing my job well enough and wondering what I might change. Looking back, rereading my notes, and talking with people who were with me then, I now see why it was such an awful and challenging time. I still feel there was an element of gaslighting and signs of prejudice. In August, the Prime Minister had used one of his favorite borrowed lines, that hard things are hard. When speaking of the work of reconciliation, there were high-level discussions around the need for clarity in our interpretation of a proper nation-to-nation relationship and need for consistency. The messaging from the Prime Minister had been good. He confirmed, as had been conveyed already, that he would be directly involved, that this work would require hard decisions and repairing relationships. He emphasized it was incumbent upon government to demonstrate our genuine commitment and that Indigenous peoples would have to lead their own rebuilding work, including their governance capacity. In quotations, we will have to take the hits on this one, the Prime Minister had said at one time. I thought this meant that maybe this would not become one of those red meat issues. But I soon began to realize that these words were not translating into clear action and moving the agenda forward. In October, my growing sense of foreboding started to become a reality. I don't know if I said that right. We seemed to be continually revisiting why we would take big steps on the Indigenous agenda, distinct from actually taking them. Questions were being raised like, what is reconciliation and what is nation-to-nation relationship? And yet these were matters around which an agenda had been laid out since well before the elections. Mandates were already in place to do this work, as well was not atypical for the PMO. They liked to seek advice from outside experts, in quotations. On Indigenous matters, they brought in author Joseph Boyden. I think Boyden had been invited because Jerry had just read the Orenda. I don't know what that is. Orenda. I don't know, guys. Orenda. And was a fan. At that point, people still thought Boyden was Indigenous. From my perspective, the process around the Indigenous agenda was seriously flawed. We were falling back to a more conventional approach for the federal government, such as establishing new ad hoc negotiations, Why are these weird words in here, guys? I feel like I should not be doing this book club right now. Ugh. We were falling back to a more conventional approach for the federal government, such as establishing new ad hoc negotiation process that would take place over years and years, while at the same time starting long consultation process about what more fundamental changes should be made. I did not agree with this. In my view, the basic solution and fundamental changes government had to make were long established, and we had already said, including in our platform, that we were going to make them. I feared government was slipping back into old colonial patterns. And then there were some upsetting dynamics in my relationship with the Prime Minister and the PMO. The Prime Minister and Jerry both felt I was being defensive, in quotations, in meetings when pushing back on the need to maintain the course on the agenda to which we had all probably agreed on. I haven't flipped the page yet. Committed, okay, which we had all committed. For God's sakes, yeah, that's what I think too, Jody. For God's sakes, we had only been in office for 1 year, and yet here they were, moving away from how they had defined the most important relationship. I was not defensive, I was not pleased, and frankly, I was upset that our government was starting to look like other governments on Indigenous issues. At the same time, they launched the broadside attacks on my staff and officials that I noted earlier. This came out most strongly at a meeting on October 12th. I cannot share the substantive content of the meeting. However, the Prime Minister was purportedly concerned about the quality of support I was getting from my deputy, my chief of staff, and my minister's office on issues of importance, from Indigenous issues to the appointment of judges. For me, these concerns were unfounded. I had complete confidence in my team, both my political staff and in the public service. I also always wanted to do everything I could to give the Prime Minister my best advice and not to be a burden to him or cause him concern. But if I'm being honest, I have sometimes wondered if there was some gaslighting going on with some of these dynamics. The reality from my vantage point was that the Prime Minister had a lot more emerging issues with his staff than I ever had with mine. More than once I have thought to myself that if he did not see it, he was blind, and if he did see it, he was a part of it, if not leading it. You guys didn't see, but I rolled my eyes hard there. I was taken aback, to say the least, and the meeting was a grunt punch. We were all working so hard, and we were doing a good job by any measure, and I thought we were doing what the Prime Minister wanted, serving him well. Was the mandate letter an illusion? I knew I would stay up at night thinking about this conversation. I left the meeting feeling very distressed regarding the substantive matters I cared so much about, yes, but also due to an unease over the fact that it seemed the PM thought I was not doing my job right or serving him in the way he wanted. I was also incensed that my staff, my deputy, and my department were seemingly being thrown under the bus. As relationships became complex and interpersonal dynamics became more challenging, I believe that all individuals bear some responsibility. Of course, it is easier to look at how others are acting than to take a hard look in the mirror. That is no different for me, for any of us. As things got harder in my relationship with the PM and the PMO, I certainly felt insecurities and confusion set in. Was the lack of progress on the Indigenous front because of me? What were my actions slowing down? How come I seem increasingly how come I seemed increasingly to be in tension with some around the table, including at times the Prime Minister? Was it my fault? I had not experienced this in my life previously. You know what, Jody? I don't think any of us have experienced all this, because what you're describing is what's going on right now with every Canadian. We're like, they've mined so bad, guys. They mined so bad. Again, I remember working very hard during this period, but I was energized by the work, and our team was a well-oiled machine. Perhaps it's a reflection of my personality and my way of doing things before coming to government that my primary response to these challenges was to encourage everyone to keep working, keep pushing, and keep pushing through. Perhaps there were other options that might have yielded different results, but this is what I knew how to do and how I had been raised to understand what leadership means. One way I pushed forward was to ensure my views were directly communicated to the Prime Minister. Of course, I did not have the Prime Minister's phone number. It was not the practice, as far as I knew, for cabinet members to be given his number. We were told to go through Jerry or make a request through the PMO switchboard. I still find it puzzling that a person in such a high leadership position would not make himself directly accessible to small groups of people who were meant to be his closest advisors. Wow. So one thing I did was write memos on critical topics and give them directly to the Prime Minister. These memos were of varying lengths and on myriad topics. I feel like I should know that word. I am not sure if the Prime Minister read all of them, but I know he read some. I would typically turn to writing one of these memos when I was at the end of my rope, so to speak, and when all other avenues to advance an approach or issue seemed to be staled or even closed. I know that the Privy Council office and the PMO did not like this memo writing practice. The clerk warned me that I had to follow the process, that there was a process for a reason. I was also told of a similar displeasure from the senior folks in the PMO who complained about the memos. I have to be honest, a Minister of Justice communicating directly with the Prime Minister, their boss, seems necessary to me, especially on important and essential matters. Again, one would hope that a Prime Minister would want to hear directly what ministers think and not have those thoughts packaged or mediated through political officials or the public service. This does not mean that the process is not important or that these means of communication do not have a vital and essential place. They do. But in my view, there is room and need for both. As far as the PMO was concerned, I had become a problem. Yes, I admit I was relentless in pushing, but that was not the problem. The problem was that they were unable to control me in the ways they wished. The PMO wanted the control, and I certainly was not content to let PMO staffers have control over substantive matters. Amazingly, there were times when the PM actually told me that this or the person on his staff was his proxy. On June 5th, 2017, Lee, who was then my chief of staff, was called to the PMO to meet with Jerry and Katie. They laid into her about me. What is wrong with your minister? She's fighting with everyone, Jerry said. They listed all my transgressions, including pushing on MMPs, pushing on Indigenous matters, and staffing. The Prime Minister is not in a happy place, they told her.
She can't be in the room alone with the Prime Minister. She hears what she wants, and she cannot give documents to the Prime Minister. Further, Jane and Jody should not hang around together. What? Oh my. Oh, wow. When I heard about this encounter, I was angry, sad, and I don't even know what the word is, and everything in between. If that is how they felt, it is a wonder they did not shuffle me sooner. But I was performing well and doing my job. I was doing what people had elected us to do. I was carrying out the Liberal platform and ticking off the directions in my mandate letter. And so I did not change anything. I was going to continue to get stuff done and going to keep trying as hard as I knew how. One day in question period, I was sitting near the Prime Minister in my usual seat. I had given him one of my memos earlier that day, and I asked him if he had read it. He obviously had, and we got to talking. Eventually, the conversation moved to how we would describe certain people and their approach to work. I asked the Prime Minister how he would describe me. I acknowledged this was a somewhat self-centered question, but in light of everything that was going on, I was really curious. He was silent for a period of time, looking thoughtful. Then with a half smile, he said, "You, Jody, are challenging and infuriating, headstrong, but that is why we love you." I remember thinking about that and resolving for myself that challenging and headstrong are within the perimeter of traits for a good mojag. After that, I began to sign my memos in a different way. "You're challenging and infuriating, headstrong, but devoted mojag." They say hindsight is 20/20. I'm not sure it is. Maybe I should have taken the Prime Minister's words in the House as a warning that we were heading into troubled waters. Not on the SNC Lavalin affair. That was not even on the horizon at that point, and not even because of clashing personalities or an inability to work together, but rather on substance, on principles, on the right decisions, because things did get far harder. On these core justice issues, and where leadership was required and decisions would need to be made on more substantive issues, getting to the finish line was going to become significantly harder. Ultimately, it turned out to be impossible, and not without coincidence. The honeymoon period of being left alone to get the big things done, as had been the case with MAID, was ending. The PMO staff efforts to control slowly became the norm and not the exception, and extended to attempts to establish greater control over my political staff as well as my department. As I mentioned, by the summer of 2017, the working group on Indigenous issues was underway. At first, it seemed as it could be an effective vehicle for change. Ministers were engaged and organized. I remember sitting in some of our early meetings just marveling at the reality that the conversation was happening. A clear schedule was set, with 3 core items moving forward: getting the 10 principles out, having initial meetings with Indigenous leaders and experts that summer, and reviewing a plan for a process and approach to working with Indigenous people on a recognition and implementation of rights framework. All of this work started out just fine. The principles came out and were generally well received. The British Columbia government effectively copied them for their own use and publicly released them. The principles did continue to cause some concern throughout government. They meant change, and people sometimes struggle with that. but they were intended as a starting point for education, innovation, and pushing within government, and they were playing that role. Over the summer, the working group had meetings that included Indigenous and non-Indigenous experts and leaders on issues of Indigenous rights. And by the end of summer, the working group had approved a high-level approach to working with Indigenous people on the framework. Although not a formal cabinet committee, this was progress. At the same time, though, negative things were still happening, almost counterintuitive to the work in progress being made through the working group. A sudden and especially odd one came that August when Jane, Carolyn, and I were suddenly called into the Prime Minister's office regarding a cabinet shovel. All three of us were down at the Slater building having our second major engagement session of the working group of ministers. Many Indigenous leaders and experts were there. We were called out one by one and asked to go see the Prime Minister. It was awkward as everyone attending the working group meeting knew something was going on. Jane was called up before me, and when she came back, I could tell she was upset. I think others could tell as well. I started getting anxious. Oh, I'm getting irritated. That was me, not Jody. I was called in next, right when the Ontario Chiefs were about to present, which was not a good look. As Lee and I walked up to the Prime Minister's office, I started to wonder if I was being shuffled, though I did not think it likely. I was not being shuffled, but what became public soon after was that the Prime Minister was splitting Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada into two ministries. Jane would move from Health and become the Minister of the new Indigenous Service Canada, and Carolyn would head up Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada. The idea of splitting up the INAC had been around for a long time, at least since 1996 when it was recommended by the Royal Commissions on Aboriginal People, RCAP. In the RCAP recommendations, the split was part of a staged and coherent plan to effectively get rid of the INAC in a principled way. It was an acknowledgement that a minister responsible for implementing the Colonial Indian Act could not also be responsible for establishing and having proper nation-to-nation intergovernmental relationships. It was also premised on the insight that INAC cannot be the entity that supports Indigenous nations to rebuild their governments, consistent with the inherent right of self-government when the INAC is legally responsible for governing over them. INAC is a colonial institution. Self-government is in the inverse of that. Ultimately, INAC needs to disappear and to be replaced by Indigenous institutions that support Indigenous government building and exercise of jurisdiction. At the working group, our recently formed plans included some dialogue with Indigenous people on such a breakup of the department, but these decisions came out of the blue. It didn't appear to be framed or supported by a clear vision of why it should be done or where we were heading. I knew the necessary detailed policy work and planning had not been done, which is why this decision left me feeling a little panicked with many questions. A more comprehensive approach and strategy was needed. It also felt unexpected and premature. We needed the framework first, along with a legislative package that would have included amending or
repealing the act that had established and continued to mandate the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, as it was known then. I was asked to attend the cabinet shuffle ceremony, even though I was not being shuffled. I was happy to be there for Jane. We'd planned to drive over to Rideau Hall together, but I received a call from Jerry early that morning, basically forbidding me from hitching a ride with Jane. He said it would be an insult to Carolyn, given the media are already going to crucify her for not being able to do her job. I took my own car. While Carolyn and I had been friends for some years, as the days and months passed, I felt we were increasingly not seeing eye to eye on how the core Indigenous work should unfold. The intricacies of the policies database are multi-layered, but in essence, I think it came down to this. I saw as fundamental to any path forward comprehensive legislative and policy shifts in how the federal government approached all relations with Indigenous peoples. Basically, that government had to get its house in order in a big way to break the pattern of Indigenous Crown relations. Carolyn was more focused on having negotiation tables and seeing progress in establishing mandates through individual agreements. She had set out to establish dozens of new ad hoc recognition of Indigenous rights and self-determination tables across the country. We actually need both. But putting your faith in negotiations when the government's mandates are not clear and the policies and mechanisms for fundamental change are sketchy or non-existent, it is not a recipe for success. It puts too much pressure on individual negotiation tables to mold the national policy. This has been the long-standing pattern to focus primarily on negotiations and long drawn-out consultations in the absence of a principled framework that recognizes and implements Indigenous rights. The most typical result, and this remains the case today, is endless years of negotiations at huge expense and with limited outcomes. An inconsistent and incoherent set of agreements and arrangements. We need a proper foundation of national legislation and policy. This includes establishing mechanisms to support self-government. We need laws and policies that affirm and uphold core self-government powers, just as our Constitution upholds distinct and clear powers for different orders of government. Those are not negotiated province by province, though how they are implemented and exercised is distinct. Of course, there will still be much to negotiate, but to negotiate distinct arrangements around the basic and core powers that Indigenous governments must exercise on a case-by-case basis will not work. It will lead to a patchwork system around how jurisdiction and power is structured and shared, one that is incoherent and will effectively continue to shift, likely for the worse, as future governments go through cycles of pulling back and slowing down the work, while others try to push ahead. In other words, Indigenous self-government will remain at the whim of political focus of the government at any particular time. Of course, this is not just a federal government challenge. It has also been an approach favored by some Indigenous groups that think everything needs to be negotiated and who resist government actually doing what they have long asked and recognizing core aspects of those rights so they can focus on implementation. There has long been talk of the Indian industry, a term that speaks to the ways in which lawyers and consultants
can dominate aspects of the work of reconciliation. Many lawyers and consultants are fantastic champions that we need, but there is also an industry, and some in that industry probably think there is less money and recognition and quick results. At least in the short term, conflict and endless negotiations can be good for business. In any case, I do not believe, and still do not, that changes in approaches to negotiations can be effective without fundamental shifts by government to recognize and implement Indigenous rights as the framework for relations. The shift has to occur first if we want to speed up and succeed in negotiations and have some consistency in relations between and among recognized Indigenous groups. Finally, while negotiations always have a place, we are wrong to think that negotiating rights should be the focus of all of our work. Take self-government, for example, my view, which is supported by both Section 35 and the Articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is that the fact of Indigenous self-government and the core powers that Indigenous governments have are not matters of negotiation. Considering the following articles from the UNDRIP, UNDRIP, I think I had said earlier, Article 3, Indigenous people have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4, Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as a way and means for financing their autonomous functions. What is needed in the case of First Nations is for the federal government to recognize the rights to self-determination, including self-government, and legislatively establish the mechanisms through which they will back off controlling First Nations through the Indian Act in cases where a First Nation says that this is what it wants. This approach was different from what Carolyn wanted, which was to maintain a focus on negotiating self-government, including its recognition and what powers a First Nation may have. As the months passed, Carolyn and I would find ourselves increasingly at the impasse and would even have a few blow-ups about issues like this. I felt like there was a paternalism emerging in the exchanges, and it made me push back even harder. There was a sense that somehow she and the CIRNA knew best. This is an attitude that is all too familiar to Indigenous people, and as history shows, it is just not true. At the working group meeting in the fall of 2017, the tensions that had thus far been private broke out into the open. Carolyn said I was being prescriptive, but followed up by saying that I was amazing and we need to protect you. She said we need the smart people to weigh in. I was not pleased substantively because it was the opposite of prescriptive to have Canada properly and legally recognize self-determination and self-government and create mechanisms to support their implementation. I also certainly did not need to be protected. Even with these tensions, we did not collaborate on moving things forward. We did collaborate on moving things forward. Carolyn and I sent a joint letter to the Prime Minister recommending that the government endorse NDP MP Romeo Sagnash's legislation, Private Members Bill C-262, to implement the UNDRIP, which was coming to the floor of the House with the caveat that we be clear in our view that the bill was just a starting point. More was needed, including a recognition and implementation of a framework to operationalize rights on the ground in communities. The Prime Minister agreed, and I announced our government's support with Carolyn in attendance at the conference in Gatineau, Quebec on November 20th, 2017. As events unfolded, that endorsement reflects what I knew to be true then. For me, that the bill was not nearly enough. It did not bind government to meaningful concrete action. It did not establish mechanisms, institutions, and supports, and it had a limited possibility of affecting real change. For government, however, that bill was ultimately the upper limit of what they were willing to do at the time in terms of recognition and implementation of rights. This is evidence in how, more than 2 years later, and with great fanfare, the government brought forward its own bill, C-15, that was basically a carbon copy of the C-262 bill from 2017, and frankly, in some respects, could be considered weaker. BC-15 received royal assent on June 21st, 2021. The inside story of the rise and fall of the recognition and implementation of a rights framework encapsulates all of these tensions. After the working group endorsed the approach in the summer of 2017, I was intent on getting it moving as soon as possible. With staff in the Justice Department, I prepared a lengthy discussion paper that could be used publicly for engagement about the framework. The discussion paper gave the history and context of the struggle for recognition of Indigenous rights, detailed the kind of solutions that had been brought forward over generations through the work of Indigenous peoples, and laid out preliminary ideas about the types of legislative and paper policy work that could be co-developed through the process and form part of the framework. The draft of the discussion paper got caught in an endless game of tag between my office, the PMO, and the CIRNA. Ultimately, even though the PMO committed to its release, they simply blocked it. To this day, it has not been released. I could also see the government lining up to do what it so often does, focus on the moment rather than the substance. The moment would be a speech ultimately given by the Prime Minister announcing a recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework in the House of Commons. This ended up being planned for February 14th, 2018. In the lead up to the speech, there were what seemed like endless efforts between the PMO, my office, and Carolyn's office to develop comprehensive materials addressing hard issues and questions that would be asked about the framework and what it meant. For weeks on end, these went back and forth in cycles. All they ultimately revealed was that the government did not have a clear understanding of what the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights meant, and had no intention of following through. All of these materials were abandoned as there was no agreement on what could or would be said. There was just a speech. February 14th, 2018, and what happened in the aftermath offers a perfect reflection of so many things that were wrong with this government and how I was caught up in it all, how the government functions and where it puts its priorities, where control in government really lies, the fraying of relationships I had with some of my colleagues, and my growing realization that it was becoming unlikely that my time in this government would or could last as long as I had once thought it would. In the months ahead of the speech, there had been also a fair amount of discussion about what engagement on framework would occur, who would lead it, and how it would unfold, but it all remained murky. There was a general idea that Carolyn would lead the engagement with Indigenous people and that I would meet with experts in certain groups. I would also give a number of speeches across the country that would provide details of the framework. The use of the discussion paper was also murky, but I was still being told it would be released around the time initial engagement got underway in early March. I was also hearing, however, that CIRNA was preparing other materials that would be used. A final version of the Prime Minister's speech was shown to me on the morning of the 14th. Some of it was good, but some of the language was off-key from an Indigenous people's perspective. I was frustrated to be seeing it at the last minute, but I went ahead and suggested a number of edits and forwarded them to the PMO. They accepted a few. Midday, Carolyn popped into my office with a member of her staff. A number of my staff were also milling about. We got into a conversation about the speech, the framework, and what we should be doing. It became very heated, no doubt a release of tensions that had been a build-up. The staff were clearly feeling uncomfortable, and Carolyn and I ended up speaking alone. It was not good. My sense of inner conflict was immense and intensifying. Based on all that had transpired up to this point, I knew there was not a clear understanding, focus, or plan for this work to unfold. At the same time, there was a part of me that I had always wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. My frustration and disappointment was complete. This government, the government I was a part of, would go down the same path as previous ones when it came to delivering on what was needed to address the legacy of colonialism. But I also so much wanted to believe that the right thing could still be done, and I had to be relentless in trying to push my colleagues to that place. This inner conflict played itself out as I told some of my staff that I was thinking of not going down to the House for the Prime Minister's speech. Some of them started to panic. Their sense was that if I did not attend, the wrath of the PMO would be over the top. I ended up with some downtime before the speech, which was to be given after question period that afternoon. I called Tim and sat in my office with a few trusted advisors coming in and out, including Rajan Dinesh. I often tease Rajan that he was too much the skeptic and too cynical about government and its willingness to effect change on Indigenous issues. While that was not totally fair, this day was different. It featured something of a role reversal. As we had been meandering chat about how we had arrived at this place and what the journey had been, which included some emotions, he gently started encouraging me to go down for the speech. He knew all of my concerns and frustrations and how upset I was, but as we talked, I remembered all the work and leadership from so many people that it had taken to even reach this moment, a moment where government would start to talk properly about Indigenous rights. We had the 10 principles, at the very least a speech about rights recognition delivered by the Prime Minister would go on the public record and offering a retelling of some of our history in useful ways. As this discourse shifts, opportunities for change will increase, and there was still my hope against hope that this government would act. We went downstairs for the speech together. I was moved by the Prime Minister's remarks. The speech was historic. The Prime Minister delivered it well, and the words were important ones. This is JT's speech. This framework gives us the opportunity to build new mechanisms to recognize Indigenous governments and ensure rigorous, full, and meaningful implementation of treaties and other agreements. With this framework, we have a chance to develop new tools to support the rebuilding of Indigenous communities, nations, and governments and advance self-determination, including the inherent right of self-government. This framework could establish new ways to resolve disputes so that collaboration becomes the new standard and conflict the exception rather than the rule. And conflict the exception rather than the rule. By including tools that oblige the federal government to be more transparent and accountable, we will build greater trust between Indigenous peoples and government. And though this new framework, we can better align Canada's laws and policies with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a declaration our government supports without qualification. By fully embracing and giving life to the existing Section 35 of the Constitution, we will replace policies like the Comprehensive Land Claims Policy and the Inherent Right of Self-Government Policy with new and better approaches that respect the distinctions between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. This will give greater confidence and certainty to everyone involved. The federal government's absence over generations in recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights has resulted in social and economic exclusion, uncertainty, and litigation, when our shared focus should have always been on creating prosperity and opportunity for everyone. Better opportunities for Indigenous peoples and certainly for Indigenous youth are precisely what we hope to achieve through this framework. After the speech, the PM gave me his marked up copy of the speech with a hand-drawn note on the front page that read, "Thank you, Jody, for leading us all on this journey," signed and dated. That was to be the last of such moments. After the speech, Carolyn began rolling out her engagement efforts across the country. CRNA produced materials without her input that frankly were insulting. I heard from many Indigenous leaders about how insulted they were. One of them memorably asked me why they were being engaged by Canada through a coloring book. The AFN was fuming about the whole approach and also felt it was not working. CIRNA refused to allow some of our staff and officials to attend Carolyn's engagement meetings. Despite the PMO's promise, they blocked the use of the discussion paper. I did give one of the speeches I was slated to at the Business Council of British Columbia in April 2018. I specifically addressed issues of Indigenous consent and economic certainty, but also laid out my vision of the framework, the same one I had been supporting for some years. After that, though, there really was nothing to be done. Predictably, the Indigenous peoples were not impressed by CIRNA's poorly conceived plan and approach. Nothing was clear about what was intended, and it was obvious the plan for any real reform was dying. The federal government never even speaks of the framework anymore, nor about bold legislative change or their core platform commitments. The change that is truly needed, that we have known is needed for decades, is not being pursued. The reality today, more endless negotiations on the same subject matter, bereft, I don't know what that is, of the rights recognition framework and without clear mandates. The Indian industry, in quotations, continues to be fed. The real work of nation rebuilding is still delayed pending the signing of agreements. The process that had been made, such as through legislation regarding Indigenous languages as well as Indigenous children, does have important elements and touches on critical issues, but it is piecemeal and not comprehensive. The calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to the justice of the MMIWG inquiry continue to languish. As all of this was playing out, I had also been advancing and wanting to release, as the Attorney General, a directive on how my department approached civil litigation involving the rights of Indigenous people. I don't know if you guys just heard my stomach growl. How's everyone doing, guys? As all of this was playing out, I had been advanced. Oh, I said that. The directive was an application of the 10 principles and designed to help the process gently of moving reconciliation out of the adversarial courts, as I said in the directive. Okay, so this is what Jody said. Litigation is by its nature an adversarial process. I think I got that right. And it cannot be the primary forum for achieving reconciliation and the renewal of the Crown Indigenous relationship. This is why a core theme of this directive is to advanced an approach to litigation that promotes resolution and settlement and seeks opportunities to narrow or avoid potential litigation. Our government is committed to pursuing dialogue, cooperation, partnership, and negotiation based on the recognition of rights. I hope that in time this litigation directive will be recognized to have brought about a significant shift in the Government of Canada's positions and strategies. I hope too that litigation will be recognized as a dispute settlement form of last resort, as trust and good faith allow collaborative process including facilitation, mediation, and negotiations to be the primary means of resolution. Well, yeah, that kind of makes sense, right, guys? There have been struggles in having the systems finalized and release the directives for months. In having the system finalize and release the directive for months, I spoke about these struggles in a speech I gave to the BC Cabinet and First Nation Leaders Gathering in November 2018. Ultimately, I released it on my last day as Mojag. Almost a year earlier, in February 2018, I had what would become a typical run-in with the PMO about the directive. One official basically forbid me from releasing it. I guess he was the Attorney General now. This triggered all sorts of internal speculation for me again about how long I could stay in this role. My acting chief of staff took a lot of the brunt of my frustration and that of the PMO at this time. At one point, another PMO official said to him, "I mean, we are dealing with the India trip," a reference to the public relation disaster around the PM's trip to India, where his penchant for dressing up in costume became a national embarrassment. We can't deal with justice issues now. That pretty much summed things up. What a joke he is. That was me. But the late summer of 2018, I was feeding the greater honesty and transparency inside of government and was needed to talk about these challenges. If all of this focus and effort on Indigenous reconciliation was not going to result in any actual legislative or significant policy change, then it was necessary to be truthful about what the challenges still were. I also decided that I would include some of my thoughts in upcoming public speeches. The idea was to include hard talk about these challenges, to basically lay out for others what I had been thinking and saying internally. I always gave my speeches to the PMO in advance. On September 13, 2018,
I gave the first of these speeches at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon immediately after a 2-day Liberal caucus meeting. I said, "Words have meaning. We live in a time where language is often appropriated and misused, co-opted and twisted, made to stand for something it is not. Recognition for Indigenous people across the country and as a basis for true reconciliation has meaning. It means that Indigenous peoples govern and own the lands that now make up Canada prior to the arrival of Europeans. It means that Indigenous laws and legal orders that stewarded the land for millennia remain and must continue to operate in the contemporary world. It means that the title and rights of Indigenous peoples are inherent and not dependent or contingent on court orders, agreements, or government action for their existence, substance, and effect. It means that treaties entered into historically must be fully implemented based on the spirit and intent, oral histories as well as texts, and consistent with the true meaning of proper nation to nation and government to government relationships. It means that the distinct and diverse governments, laws, cultures, societies, and ways of life of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are fully respected and reflected. For Canada, recognition means resetting our foundation to properly reconcile to finish the unfinished business of Confederation. What is more, for many Indigenous people, recognition is the lifeline that will ensure the survival and rebuilding of their cultures, languages, and governing systems within an even stronger Canada. But words are also easy, cheap. And too often we see the tendency, especially in politics, to use important words that have real meaning and importance carelessly. We have them being applied to ideas and actions that in truth do not reflect their actual meaning, even sometimes their opposite. We see recognition applied to ideas that actually maintain denial. We see self-government used to refer to ideas or process that actually maintain control over others. We see self-determination applied to actions that actually interfere with the work of nations rebuilding their governments and communities. We see inherent in the same breath as the contradictory idea that rights are contingent on the courts or agreements. When we see this done, it does not advance reconciliation. It actually undermines it. It causes confusion, chaos, and division. It treats a challenge that is vital for survival and well-being of children, women, families, and communities across this country, as a game of rhetoric. Yeah, rhetoric. That was in quotations. It trivializes, often out of ignorance or political expediency, a moral, social, and economic imperative for our country. Words in the work of reconciliation are also cheap without real action that goes to the core of undoing a colonial law, policies, and practices, and that is based on the real meaning of reconciliation. We all need to understand this.
The path of justice and equality is not advanced or achieved through half measures, good intentions, or lofty rhetoric, and it is certainly not achieved through I don't even know what that word is, or confusion, but what we mean when we speak. Hard choices, innovative actions, transformations in law and policies, new understandings and attitudes, new patterns of behavior. This is what is needed. A parliamentary secretary was in attendance at the lecture. At dinner afterwards, he was enthusiastic about the speech and recognized it was different from what CIRNA was currently advancing. I am not sure he fully understood how directly I was criticizing the government, but I appreciated his sentiment nonetheless. I gave 3 more speeches like this before the end of the year, and at the same time the idea of this government recognizing and implementing Indigenous rights died its death. The government moved on as if the Prime Minister had never given a speech on February 14th, 2018. On September 17th, 2018, I was to meet with the Prime Minister. I had requested the meeting to deal with the collapse of the rights recognition agenda. The meeting would become infamous later due to the SNC-Lavalin affair, but as I walked up to Center Block and waited outside in the Horseshoe, my focus was on trying to convince the Prime Minister to do the right thing on Indigenous issues. Well, I guess he got a little pouty there, right? Maybe this was my last chance to convince him to carry out what the February 14th speech had promised. Ever the optimist, I felt it was a good sign that he had accepted the meeting. I was surprised when I walked in and saw Michael Wernick. Immediately the PM asked about SNC-Lavalin. In hindsight, I think he had accepted the meeting because they really wanted to pressure me about the SNC-Lavalin, and this was the best way to do it. He could not very well schedule a meeting to do so, apparently more important than Indigenous issues or justice reform was figuring out how to get this company out of hot water. And it was the most challenging issue for them because on it I was acting as the Attorney General. On Indigenous issues and MMPs and so many other things, I was the Minister of Justice. In that role, I was working to dialogue, debate, and find policy solutions as part of government decision-making, not as Attorney General, where by law I had to play an independent role and they could not influence or shape my decision. Makes sense? But I'm sure they did, right? Oh, I can't wait. This is going to get juicy, guys. Well, that September 17th meeting has now been well documented. This is when I flat out challenged the Prime Minister on whether or not he was trying to pressure me, an incident that is now public knowledge. We did eventually get to talking about the rights recognition framework and Indigenous issues at the end of the meeting, but the PM's mind was still focused on SNC-Lavalin. As for Indigenous issues, he had made up his mind, and that was not going to change. Oh no, because he's Trudeau and he's a dictator. Emphasis on the dictator. Towards the end of the conversation, as I was leaving his office, I exclaimed to him that my granny was rolling over in her grave. From my perspective, MMPs had similarly derailed about a year earlier. This message I heard was that we were out of runway on MMPs and that staff was being blamed. This was increasingly a common theme, blame the staff or the department.
I even formed an understanding that the trade-offs might be possible, get rid of some staff that the PMO did not like, Lee in particular, and perhaps there may be progress on some issues. I just could not back down. We were on the wrong side of history on this. Progressive states do not throw away the key on marginalized peoples. I would hear things like, we don't have the support and we don't want you to lose a vote on the floor of the House of Commons. I got it, as the Prime Minister said, red meat issues, which meant 2 years into a mandate, core promises and issues were DOA. Ugh. What's DOA mean? Probably done deal, something. I could not reconcile this in my mind. I did not know how I would be able to look myself in the mirror if we did not do this. For all my efforts, I felt that I was just making the Prime Minister angry. I knew he was facing challenges on multiple fronts, and the pressures were mounting. The Prime Minister, as it is undoubtedly always the case, was under immense pressure these days, or those days, but still these days. But I felt it was always the right time to do the right thing. So I kept pushing, sometimes to the point of utter frustration and tears, especially after the events regarding Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine. But I knew it was to no avail. The political case was clear in his mind. This would lead us to lose the election. For some, this could have been the straw that broke the camel's back. The prevailing wisdom that I could discern at the time was MMPs were a political loser and a winner for the Conservatives. It felt like the issue went around and around and just kept going in circles. Probably there were some choices I could have made better or differently on those core justice matters of Indigenous rights and MMPs. I could have been more strategic, at times more cooperative, and in some ways more flexible, but I'm not sure much would have changed substantively. I think little would have been done on these issues regardless, just in ways that might have been less intense for many of us. The course judicial appointments took and have continued to take reflected this. I loved making the calls to new judges to tell them of their appointment to the bench. They would always know a call was coming, as they were well planned. Many of these calls stick in my mind. I remember one person responding to my call by recounting how she had applied before during the Harper years and telling me, I'm a lesbian. Another time I caught someone in their car and asked them to please pull over your car. I don't want you to break the law. Another person responded by asking, can I have time to check with my wife? Which was a little strange. There were tears and screams and plain simple happiness. Despite all the work and the commitment to moving political interference from the judicial appointments process and the quality of the judges who were being appointed, as time passed, there was unfortunately attempts at interference. Some of this became public when stories were published in the media, but beyond what has been reported, many other tactics were used to try to influence appointments, such as the PMO insisting on receiving my detailed and confidential lists with the raw data of feedback from validators and other processes about appointees. Sometimes there would be a full court press from the PMO, ministers, other MPs, and influential liberals who would contact me trying to advance a particular appointment.
This even occurred when a particular individual had not been recommended through our comprehensive vetting process. Of course, another way to influence appointments was simply to delay them. None of these attempts to influence worked or impacted my appointments. In one of my little black notebooks, I have a quote that Katie Black from my office shared with me. Beware of moderate liberals who tell you the timetable for seeking justice. I guess that sums up well my time as Mojag on these issues. As had always been my way, as taught by my granny and others, I pushed for big change. On Indigenous reconciliation, headway was made, but truly tangible and long overdue changes, which are urgent, remain outstanding. On MMPs, the government simply would not move. On judicial appointments, we have a more diverse bench, but the process is still not insulated enough from politics. I would say in 2020, in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how government is capable of making big, bold change quickly when there is a crisis before them. Simply stated, government does not see the dire reality that many Indigenous people live in as a crisis. It can wait until government says the time is right. It has been that way for more than 150 years. We continue to wait. And that is the end of chapter 6. And then there are pictures of Jody throughout her life. Okay, guys, this is chapter 6 summary. Okay, there's a lot to take in, and to be honest with you, it's hard to understand all of these legislations, previous, new. But I think the meat and taters of it is this Indian Act is quite offensive to the Indigenous people. It comes up quite often. And the reason it is so offensive for them is because it was made during Confederation. And basically, from what I've seen my whole life and what we continue to see, is that the Indigenous have uncertainty from everything that they were promised over the years. So that's where their issues are. And then throughout the chapter, Jody brought up red meat topics, or that's somewhere a little bit further. Red meat issues, maybe that's what it was. And that's when, they bring forward, what was it, something during election time, and act like they're going to do something about it. Is that how that went? Where did I find that? Okay, so it is around election time they bring up the red meat issues, okay? And it says, Jody writes on page 155 near the bottom, honestly, if you have no intention of moving on a red meat issue, even if you know it needs to be dealt with, then do not run on it or give people the impression you will do something about it. Oh man, guys. And right now that's occurring again, because what I've noticed from the news recently, well, what are they going through the landfill in Manitoba somewhere looking for Indigenous women? Well, when was the last time we talked about really Indigenous issues from the federal government? Well, I think it was probably around last election time, right? Because they don't follow through with anything that they say, okay? And I just kind of going through the list, however, I jumped ahead on that red meat issue. But going back to kind of the beginning of the chapter, Jody was working on minimum mandatory penalties, and that was based on some Indigenous or minority cultures
facing discrimination and not, maybe their sentencing maybe was a little too hard. Okay, well, at this point, we have went so far since Jody's book, and everything that Jody writes about has been good intention. However, she thought one way and liberals thought the other. So Jody wanted to make minimum mandatory penalties a little bit more, I think treatment based, right? Like if somebody was on drugs and they did something, like help them through that. But now we have nobody facing jail time at all. Nobody has rights, particularly women, okay? Particularly kids. We have perverts, pedophiles, violence on the street, okay? It is not safe. So I feel at this point, no, everybody needs to face minimum mandatory penalties. And this isn't any knock against you, Jody. It is just the fact that we have changed so much since your book was written, and all of the hard work and good intentions you had, you were really plowed over. And that's too bad, Jody, because you did have good intentions, but I feel we have to stick with minimum mandatories, okay, guys? Because I wrote this, now everyone's crying about it. People are milking, uh, you know, um, whether it was their mental health or because they're a minority, okay? And we can't have that, okay? You have true victims, and then you have people milking off of it. And I just posted the other day about a woman who was set on fire by some guy in Toronto. She didn't know. He poured fuel on her and set her on fire, and now he's saying about it's schizophrenia. Well, you know what? If we had better treatment for people early on, back to kids, and had workers that, you know, uh, checked in constantly on people with schizophrenia and whatnot, then it would help keep them on the straight and narrow. But you can't use, if you've done something so crazy, well, I'm sorry, there's mental health and then there's just crazy. And, well, that guy should never have been, given such a slap on the wrist, guys. I'm off topic, but it's relevant because it's going on right now. Oh, Jody had said on page 145 to make government more accountable because over like their history, their treaties have been broken, their rights ignored, court decisions not implemented. And this is how the Indigenous continue to feel oppressed by the government. And guys, we have to quit. I'm sorry the white people caused everybody such turmoil, but what do we know about government, okay? It was the government that caused all of this. Almost said the S word, guys. Everybody in government. And at the time, it appeared that it was mostly white people because that's who came over, okay, guys? But right now, who's oppressing you is everybody in government. And if you haven't noticed, government is very diverse right now. So if people could quit knocking us white people, because white people have such guilt. And I think that's half the problem why Canada is in the shape we're in, is because we just want to go along with everything because nobody wants to say that they feel like they're a racist because we feel bad for everything that's happened in the past. But you know what? What happened in the past was barbaric. There was no society. There was no change until, people made the change, guys, okay? So we can't help what happened back then. But what we can do is focus on right now, because the current government that is full of diversity are still ignoring the Indigenous people, okay? And I'm truly not trying to be rude. What bothers me right now is people coming to Canada and saying how oppressed they've been when, uh, you know, everybody wanted to come to Canada because Canada was diverse and we were happy, and Trudeau has turned it upside down, okay, guys? So we have to go back to thinking how things used to be. Why did immigrants want to come here? Because we were just a big happy family. The Indigenous and white people were starting to get along, and we still are, because when I've spoken with Indigenous people, I know they don't like Trudeau either, guys. Okay, I'm going to get back to the book. But I still feel that's all relevant. Okay, just kind of going down the list. Jody was, implementing, helping with some of this Indigenous change that was spoken about during Trudeau's campaign. She started the 10 principles, formed a cabinet, and it was to be a historic and renewal of Indigenous relationships. However, Jody was starting to feel like she wasn't being heard, being told what to do by the PMO dictated on Indigenous rights. They wanted her to bring her vision to be more in line with the CIRNA. She said that, that government was like, trust us, do as we say, we know best. And Jody was like, oh yeah, we've heard that before, and, kind of wish she had trusted her guts, right? Jody said that it's really important for Indigenous people to talk directly and engage with high-level leaders in Canada, such as the Prime Minister and senior leaders, because it shows respect of what all they have been through, okay? Jody talked a lot about self-governing and all of that stuff with what they want. And I don't know how that's all going to work. How, if they really did have a self-governance, how would that work? I personally would like to see some sort of Indigenous party run for Canada, rather than, I would hate to see. I mean, I like my Indigenous friends and family. I love them. I don't really want to see them break away, because I feel like we need your help more than ever. And I think that you guys should really focus on getting yourself a political party going. But anyways, the Indigenous were willing to talk about all this stuff, and that's the problem with all of this, is that they've talked over the years and nothing has happened. Then came time for Jody to start appointing judges. There were a lot of judges to fill, and she wanted it done properly. She needed a government and system to serve the people past the next election, because Jody was always focused on the future, not just during the election, okay? Because that's what they do. They're just worried about getting in, rather than what can they do for the long term of Canada. Red meat issue, I talked about that. And she said about appointing judges became political interference in the appointment process. She felt pressured about it. Okay, I said that. The PM started questioning her and her staff. The PM began having more, but the PM the Prime Minister questioned Jody and her staff advisor. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister had more issues with his staff. And Jody felt he was part of the problem, if not leading the problem. Okay, and that was on page 158. Jody began questioning herself because she was having such kickback from the Prime Minister, the PMO's office, because they were wanting her to go their way. Meanwhile, it was against everything that they had preached about, basically, in their political campaign. she began questioning herself if she was doing her job right, and basically got mind beep like the rest of us guys, okay? Because everyone, like, I mean, do you not often think, like, is it just me? Was Canada not better before Trudeau? Anyways, she didn't like how there was a lack of process, and she never felt that way. She had to remind herself of values, morals, and how she was brought up to be a leader. She didn't have Trudeau's phone number. He didn't give it to his small group of closest advisors, so she wrote him memos. And then there became problems with the memos, giving her issues. People were giving her issues like they were the Attorney General when Jody was the Attorney General. They felt Jody was a problem because they couldn't control her. The PMO was so upset with Jody. Somebody had said the PM was not in a happy place, and that Jody could not be left alone with the Prime Minister. Jody and her friend Jane were forbidden to hang out. Okay, that's what the PMO Trudeau wanted. That was page 160. Page 162, the PMO staff tried to control Jody and her department. The cabinet shuffle, that was unexpected during the Ontario Chief Assembly Parliament to present. Jody said it was not a good look when that happened, and Jody wasn't moved, but Jane was moved into another position off of Jody's team, and it was new Indigenous legislation, maybe. I don't know if I have the right term, but it was splitting the INAC, the Indian Northern Affairs Canada, and they talked about splitting this in 1996. Because this INAC is a colonial institution. Well, if you just think about what I just said and how, they were going to do something about it in 96 and they didn't, see how nothing happens with the Indigenous people, guys? She said it was all push-pull change of government, no real change with Indigenous. And she also said that some of the Indigenous groups were responsible for this because everybody wanted to just negotiate rather than recognize the attempts made by the government in past. And so Jody recognized that sometimes people in her group don't make the right decisions. Just like people in my group, if you're going to Pride, keep your junk in the trunk. I just said that in my last video. And guys, it's really important to hold your people to the test, because I don't want to be associated with anybody acting like a pervert, okay, guys? If I'm at a Pride event, if I see something where it appears that somebody is exposing their junk to kids, it is your moral and legal obligation to contact the cops. Let them know that there's a pervert in the crowd. I'll tell you, nobody is going to, I will not stand behind somebody like that. So it's nice that Jody has the same philosophy as me. Okay. And page 166, they talked more about self-determination, self-government, and back off controlling the First Nations. And I think that the Indigenous, that's all they want, right? They just want to be able to control more of their lives. And the biggest thing that keeps coming up is the Indian Act. We got to change that. We got to change the name, I would assume, and we got to make it more up to date and consulting. You know who's the biggest advocate right now for Indigenous people is Danielle Smith out in Alberta. She is always consulting the Indigenous people. And that's how Confederation, or sorry, not Confederation, that is, well, that's how we hope to move past Confederation for the Indigenous people, right? Right, guys? And then Jody ended up having issues with Carolyn. They worked together but they were split up. They were working together on the UNDRIP, UNDRIP bill, and they worked on it. But then the government brought in their own bill in June 21st, 2021. And I'm noticing a lot throughout this book that everything that people had worked on got changed in 2021. And guess what? That was COVID, right, guys? That was COVID, and everyone got away from everything, okay, guys? And yeah, a lot of stuff got changed in 2021 that I'm noticing. The draft of the framework for these new bills was blocked and nothing more done. Trudeau on February 14th, 2017, page 171, Trudeau's speech was on recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights frame. What page is that? Okay, so then Jody didn't see any action, and Jody's speech she always gave prior to the PMO's office, and the speech she was about to give was forbidden. And that's again the PMO's telling the Attorney General what to do. Page 174, Jody used her speech to address the issues that were being ignored. But like I said, she gave the PMO's office her speech in advance. Like she said, words have meaning. There was basically no action, and that there's unfinished business of Confederation, okay, guys? And then on page 177, September 17th, Jody asked to meet with the Prime Minister because she felt like he was done with the Indigenous topics. Like he pouted and that was it. She asked to meet with him, and the only reason he accepted her meeting that she felt was to be pressured by the PMO about helping him with this SNC Lavaland scandal. And there was no more talk of Indigenous issues like promised on February 14th, 2017. Okay, guys? The issues on MMPs, which was the minimum mandatory penalties issues, was DOA, dead on arrival. But now everything's screwed up, right, guys? Because they changed everything from what I'm gathering. And it goes back to, again, Jody had good intentions originally. Nobody's doing jail anymore. She talked again, page 179, about the appointments of the judges, how they were influenced. And talking about modern liberals, that you had to watch out for modern liberals. Okay, I think that's what it was. Page 180, there was the COVID. She talked about how the government, during a crisis like COVID, they're able to make big, bold changes quickly, and they sure did, because they seem to have changed everything during COVID. Was the end of chapter 6. I don't know what everyone else thought, but that's what I thought, and I read it and then listened to it again, and I take my notes when I listen to it again and go over it and piece it all together. That's when I take my notes. So I've basically listened to each chapter twice, guys. Tell me what you think. Anyways, stay true. Get to talking and get to reading, and chapter 7 will be coming up, when I get to it, okay? Hopefully soon. Okay, guys?